The snow outside my kitchen window had been falling since Tuesday, the kind of slow, steady Ohio snowfall that fills up the silence until the silence is all you can hear. I sat at the table with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, watching the flakes pile up against the fence post my son Daniel had helped me build the summer before everything fell apart. He was 17 then. He'd hammered every nail crooked and laughed about it. I'd told him we'd fix them later. We never did. My name is Frank Calloway. I'm 63 years old, and I spent 31 years as a high school principal in Dayton, Ohio. I shaped young lives. That's what people said at my retirement party. I kept kids on the right path. I was the man parents called when their children were heading somewhere they shouldn't. I was good at my job, and I was completely useless the one time my own son needed me most. Daniel was 29 when they arrested him. March 12th, 5 years ago. I remember the exact date the way you remember certain things that cleave your life into a before and after. He'd worked as a financial analyst at Hargrove Capital Partners for 3 years. His boss, Raymond Hargrove III, ran the kind of firm that had its name on the side of a building downtown and sent its employees to charity galas on Thursday nights. Raymond was 60, silver-haired, the sort of man who made you feel underdressed just by standing next to you. Daniel admired him. I never liked the way Raymond looked at my son like he was useful, not valued. The charges were wire fraud and embezzlement. $412,000 allegedly moved through shell accounts that the prosecution claimed Daniel had created. The evidence was digital, thorough, and almost entirely fabricated. I say almost because somewhere in that mountain of spreadsheets and transaction logs, someone had done very careful work to make it look real. The kind of careful that takes resources. The kind of careful that doesn't come from a 29-year-old analyst living in a one-bedroom apartment in Kettering. Daniel told me he didn't do it. He told me the morning after his arrest, sitting across from me in the county jail visitation room with a bruise forming under his left eye from the processing center, calm in a way that frightened me more than tears would have. Dad, I didn't touch that money. I know what this looks like. But I need you to believe me. I believed him. His attorney was a decent man, with an impossible caseload, and a prosecution that had seemingly airtight documentation. Raymond Hargrove testified for 90 minutes, composed and heartbroken, explaining how Daniel had been given special access to client accounts, how he'd noticed irregularities, how he'd confronted Daniel privately before going to the authorities. He wiped his eyes twice. The jury watched him do it. Daniel was convicted after 4 days of deliberation, sentenced to 5 years, eligible for parole in 3. I sat in that courtroom and watched them take my son through a side door in handcuffs, and he turned back and looked at me, and the look on his face wasn't fear. It was something I didn't understand until much later. It was apology. I did everything a father could do in the years that followed. I hired a second attorney who filed appeals that went nowhere. I contacted the Ohio Innocence Project and was told our case didn't meet the threshold for their intake. I wrote letters to the state bar. I drove 3 hours each way to visit Daniel at the correctional facility in Chillicothe every single month without exception. Even the February he had pneumonia, and they almost turned me away at the gate. Even the Christmas when the roads were so bad that I slid off the highway twice and sat in a ditch for 40 minutes waiting for a tow truck, and then kept driving anyway because I had told my son I would be there. My wife, Carol, had passed from a stroke when Daniel was 12. I had raised him alone after that, just the two of us in the house on Elmwood Drive. After his conviction, the house felt like a set from a play that nobody was performing anymore. His bedroom, his old baseball trophies on the shelf, the crooked fence posts in the yard. I kept the lights on in his room. I don't know why. Something about darkness in that room felt final in a way I couldn't accept. I retired from the school district 8 months after Daniel went in. I told myself it was time. The truth was, I couldn't stand in front of a classroom of other people's children and talk about integrity and second chances without feeling like a fraud. My son was in prison for something he didn't do, and I had not been able to stop it. What could I possibly teach anyone about anything? 3 years into Daniel's sentence, he was granted parole. He came home on a Thursday afternoon in November, thinner than I'd ever seen him, with new lines around his eyes and a way of standing with his back to walls that wasn't there before. He moved back into his old room and got a job stocking shelves at a distribution warehouse in Moraine because nobody in financial services would touch him now. He had a felony conviction. He had Raymond Hargrove's name attached to a fraud case. In a field built entirely on trust, he was finished. He didn't talk about what had happened. Not the crime, not the trial, not the 3 years inside. When I tried, he would redirect gently, the way you steer someone away from a hole in the ice. He was patient with me. He was almost too patient, like a man who had accepted something I hadn't been told yet. I watched him, and I wondered what he was carrying that he hadn't put down. Then, 14 months after Daniel came home, on a Wednesday morning in January, when the snow was doing exactly what it was doing now, someone knocked on my front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the side window before opening it, a habit I'd developed over the years, and saw a young woman I didn't recognize. Late 30s, maybe 40, dark coat, holding a leather portfolio case against her chest with both arms, like she was protecting it from the cold. She looked at the door with the expression of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say many times and was now not sure any of it was right. I opened the door. The cold came in around her. "Mr. Calloway?" she asked. "Frank Calloway?" "Depends on what you're selling," I said. Old habit. Deflection before information. She didn't smile. "My name is Teresa Voss. I used to work at Hargrove Capital Partners. I was Daniel's colleague." She paused. "Mr. Calloway, I know what really happened. I have proof. And I've been trying to decide whether to come here for 2 years, and I'm sorry it took me this long, but I'm here now, and I need you to let me show you what I found." My first instinct was to close the door. Not because I thought she was lying, because I had lived with hope before. I had fed it carefully for 3 years, and watched it die in courtrooms and in the faces of attorneys who wouldn't meet my eyes. I knew what hope felt like when it turned on you, but I stepped back and let her in. She sat at the kitchen table where I'd been sitting alone all morning and set the portfolio case in front of her, and she told me her story before she opened it. She had worked in compliance at Hargrove Capital for 4 years. She and Daniel had been friendly, not close friends, but the kind of coworkers who covered for each other during lunch and complained about the copy machine. When Daniel was arrested, she had been as shocked as anyone. Raymond had called a company meeting. He'd been solemn and gracious about it. A difficult situation. Betrayal by someone we trusted. The company would cooperate fully. Teresa had believed it. She had been assigned to assist the internal audit team that came in afterward, reviewing accounts and transaction logs. And 3 weeks into that process, she found something that didn't fit. A timestamp. One of the key transactions in Daniel's case. A transfer that the prosecution had used to establish his pattern of behavior had a server timestamp of 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in February. Teresa knew, because she had personally verified it as part of a different audit 6 months earlier, that Daniel had been logged out of the system since 6:30 that evening. She had the original access log. She had compared it against the transaction log entered into evidence and found a discrepancy of 4 seconds in the metadata that only existed because someone had edited the original file and not perfectly synced the timestamp to the server record. 4 seconds. Daniel's entire conviction had a 4-second crack running through its foundation. She had brought this to her supervisor. Her supervisor had told her the discrepancy was likely a system glitch and had been addressed. 2 weeks later, Teresa was informed that her position was being eliminated due to restructuring. She was given a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement. She signed the NDA because she had student loans and a mother in an assisted living facility in Cincinnati, and she was frightened in the particular way that young women get frightened when powerful men suddenly remind them how small they are. Done. For 2 years, she had lived with it. She'd left compliance work and gone back to school for forensic accounting. She'd built a file, not because she planned to use it, but because she needed to understand the full shape of what she had found. And the full shape, she told me, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands flat on the portfolio case, was considerably larger than 4 seconds. She opened the case. The documents were organized, tabbed, and annotated in red ink. She walked me through them methodically, the way you explain something to someone you need to actually understand, not just nod along. Raymond Hargrove had been running a parallel investment scheme for 11 years. Client funds were being cycled through subsidiary accounts, skimmed at fractions of percentages across thousands of transactions, then consolidated in a series of holding companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. The amounts per transaction were small enough to pass routine audits. The aggregate, over 11 years, Teresa estimated at somewhere between $8 and $12 million. Daniel had found it. Not all of it, but enough. He'd noticed a pattern in the subsidiary routing during a routine reconciliation. He'd documented it. He'd gone to Raymond directly, because he trusted Raymond, because he was 29 and had not yet learned that trust is a luxury that costs you something eventually. Raymond had thanked him and told him he would look into it. And then Raymond had spent the next 3 weeks building a case that would bury Daniel under $400,000 of fabricated fraud before Daniel could bury him. My hands were shaking by the time she finished. Not from anger, though the anger was there, deep and hot. They were shaking because I was looking at my son's life, the 3 years he'd spent in Chillicothe, the job at the warehouse, the way he stood with his back to walls now, laid out in red-inked documents on my kitchen table, and I was calculating the cost of what Raymond Hargrove had decided to do. "Why are you coming forward now?" I asked her. "The NDA." She looked down at the table. "I talked to a lawyer 6 months ago. She said NDAs don't protect criminal activity. If Raymond used his position to frame Daniel, the NDA is unenforceable." She paused. "And I'm a mother now. I have a daughter. She's 8 months old." I kept thinking, what if someone let something like this go when my daughter needed them not to? There was a second reason she hadn't said yet. I could see it in the way she was holding herself. I waited. "There's something else," she said. "Something I didn't find in the documents. Something Daniel told me." I went still. "She had called Daniel 3 weeks ago," she said. "She'd found his number and called him and told him she was coming to see me. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he had told her that he already knew about Raymond's scheme when he was arrested. He had known from the moment he realized what Raymond was doing, that Raymond had the connections to make charges stick. Raymond had told him explicitly, the night before the arrest, that if Daniel cooperated, stayed quiet, didn't bring his father into it, the matter would be handled quietly, and Daniel might walk away with a reduced charge. Raymond had also told him what would happen to me specifically, to my pension, to my teaching license, to a carefully fabricated paper trail that Raymond had apparently prepared if Daniel chose to fight. My son had let them convict him to protect me. I sat there in my kitchen, and I couldn't speak for a long time. Outside, the snow kept falling against the fence posts he'd helped me build, the nails still crooked, still waiting for a later that had kept not arriving. I thought about him sitting in that courtroom looking at me with that expression I couldn't name. I knew what it was now. He had been apologizing for a decision I hadn't known he'd made. He had decided I was worth more than 3 years of his life, and he had never told me, because he knew that if I knew, I would have burned everything down. He was right. I would have. I looked at Teresa across the table. "What do we do with this?" She reached into the portfolio and pulled out a business card. She slid it across to me. "I've already spoken to this man. He's a federal prosecutor. White-collar crime division in the Southern District of Ohio. I didn't go to him with accusations. I went to him with documents. He wants to meet with you." I picked up the card. I turned it over. "Put it down." "Where's Daniel right now?" I asked. "At work," she said. "He doesn't know I came today. He told me not to. He said you'd been through enough." I stood up. I put on my coat. Teresa looked at me. "You're going to the warehouse," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to get my son," I said. "And then we're going to see this man together." Daniel's first reaction when I walked into the warehouse and found him in aisle 7 with a pallet jack was to look alarmed. "Dad, what happened? Are you okay?" "You knew," I said. "You knew what Raymond was doing, and you knew what he would do to me, and you didn't fight it." He set the pallet jack down slowly. Around us, the warehouse hummed and beeped with machinery. He looked at me the way he'd looked at me in that courtroom, and now I could read it correctly. Not apology for something he'd done wrong. Apology for a choice he'd made that he believed was right. I wasn't going to let him take you with me, Daniel said. You were 60 years old. Your pension, your license. He had a whole file, Dad. He showed it to me. Dates, invoices, account numbers. It was fake, but it was convincing enough to cost you everything. You'd already lost Mom. I wasn't going to let him take the rest. I'm 63, I said. And you're my son. I know. You don't get to decide that I matter more than 3 years of your life. He looked at the floor. Someone had to. I crossed aisle 7 and I put my arms around him. He was still thinner than he used to be. He stood stiff for a moment, surprised. And then he wasn't. And we stood there between the pallets in the noise of the warehouse. And I thought about every decision I had made that had brought us both here, to this place, to this moment. Teresa was waiting in my car in the parking lot. We drove to the federal building in downtown Dayton together, the three of us. The prosecutor was a methodical man named Garrett, who wore his suit like he'd been born in it and listened to everything Teresa presented without writing anything down, and then asked 37 minutes of precise, quiet questions. He had read Teresa's initial disclosure. He had people who could look at the timestamp discrepancy. He was very careful not to make any promises. But at the end of the meeting, as we stood in the hallway outside his office, he said, Mr. Calloway, I want you to understand that if the documents Miss Voss has provided are substantiated, and I have reason to believe they will be, we are not looking at a wrongful conviction case alone. We are looking at a significant federal fraud investigation with potentially multiple defendants. This is going to take time, but I want you to know we take it seriously. It took 7 months. I won't pretend those 7 months were simple. There were weeks of silence when I didn't know what was happening and couldn't call anyone to ask. There were nights when Daniel came home from the warehouse and sat at the dinner table, and I could see the old guardedness in his face. The instinct to protect himself from believing in something that might collapse. I understood it. I had the same instinct. We were both men who had learned that hope could be weaponized against you if you held it carelessly. But we held it together, and that made it different. The investigators found considerably more than Teresa's documents. They subpoenaed Raymond's personal financial records and found accounts in the Cayman Islands that nobody at Hargrove Capital had ever been authorized to open. They found the Delaware shell companies. They found emails between Raymond and his chief operating officer, discussing what they called the liability situation in the weeks before Daniel's arrest. One email used Daniel's name. It said, Calloway is too thorough. We need the file completed before he finds the second layer. The second layer was another $4 million, routed through medical billing companies that Raymond partially owned. The total, when the forensic accountants finished, was $11.3 million over 14 years. Raymond Hargrove III was arrested on a Thursday morning at his house in Indian Hill. I know because Teresa called me when she saw it on the news. His chief operating officer was arrested the same day. 2 compliance officers who had been complicit in the cover-up were arrested the following week. Daniel and I watched the news coverage on the television in the living room, and Daniel was very quiet, and I didn't push him to say anything, because sometimes there are no words for the specific shape of what you're feeling. The wrongful conviction process moved in parallel. The Ohio Innocence Project, the same organization that had told me years ago that our case didn't meet their threshold, reached out to Daniel's attorney directly. The evidentiary hearing took 3 months. The judge who had sentenced Daniel the first time was not the same judge who vacated the conviction, but she reviewed the original trial record and the new evidence and issued a ruling that was 52 pages long and contained, in its conclusion, the sentence. The evidence before this court establishes that Mr. Calloway's conviction was obtained through fraudulent means, orchestrated by the primary witness against him. Daniel was exonerated on a Tuesday in October, which turned out to be a warm day for the month. We stood outside the courthouse in the October light, the 2 of us and Teresa and Daniel's attorney, and someone took a photograph. Daniel is squinting into the sun in it. He looks like himself. He looks like the boy who hammered the fence posts crooked and laughed about it. Raymond Hargrove was convicted on 9 federal counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 18 years. His chief operating officer received 12. The two compliance officers cooperated with the prosecution and received reduced sentences of 4 years each. With restitution, the firm's remaining assets were seized, and a receiver was appointed to compensate defrauded clients. The Cincinnati Enquirer ran a piece about the case that was picked up nationally. Several people who had worked with Raymond for years told reporters they were shocked. I wasn't shocked. I was tired in the particular way that comes after something you've been holding finally gets set down. Daniel filed a civil claim against Raymond and Hargrove Capital Partners separately. The settlement, which the firm's insurance carrier negotiated because fighting it would have cost more than paying it, was for $840,000. I know this because Daniel told me. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, at the same spot where Teresa had laid out her documents in January, and he told me the number and watched my face. "It's not enough," I said. "No," he said. "But it's something." He used part of it to pay off his mother's medical debt. The debt Carol had left behind, that I'd been managing in installments for 12 years and had told him we didn't need to talk about. He didn't ask. He just paid it. When I found out, I went to his bedroom door and knocked and said his name, and then couldn't think of anything else to say. "You don't have to say anything, Dad," he said. "I know." He left the warehouse job in the spring. It had been the right job for the right time, he said. But the right time was over. He spent 2 months studying for the Certified Financial Planner exam, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with textbooks spread out the way he'd once done with homework when he was 17. He passed on his first attempt. He's working now for a small firm in Centerville that does retirement planning for teachers and public employees. He told me that last part with a slight smile, and I understood what he meant. Teresa became something our family doesn't quite have a word for. Not a friend, though she is a friend. She came to dinner twice in the months after the trial. She brought her daughter, who is a year old now and has a very strong opinion about sweet potatoes. Daniel held her for a while after dinner, and I watched him and thought about what a long distance we had traveled to arrive at an ordinary evening in a warm house. I'm 63 years old. I have a bad hip that I've been ignoring since my mid-50s, and a hearing aid I keep forgetting to wear because I find it annoying. I volunteer 3 mornings a week at an alternative school in East Dayton, working with students who have been expelled from district schools and need somewhere to go. I'm not their principal. I'm not in charge of anything. I sit with them, and sometimes they want to talk and sometimes they don't, and I have learned that both are all right. Some of them remind me of Daniel at 17. Not in any specific way, but in the general way that young people remind you of the young person you raised when you were paying the most important attention of your life. We fixed the fence last spring, Daniel and I, on a Saturday morning with new lumber and a level, pulling out the crooked posts one by one and setting them straight. He was better at it than he'd been at 17. I was worse. At some point, he gently took the hammer from me and said, "Dad, I love you, but please let me do this part." I stood back and watched him work. The yard looks different with the fence straight, more solid. Like it was always supposed to look this way and we just needed enough time to get there. I think about Raymond Hargrove sometimes. Not often, and not with what I would call hatred, though I won't tell you the anger is entirely gone. I think about the calculation he made, the specific decision to look at my son and determine that Daniel was expendable, that a 29-year-old financial analyst with too much integrity was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be reckoned with. I think about how certain he must have been that it would work, that I was just a retired school principal, that Daniel would eventually accept what had happened and go quiet, that men like Raymond don't fall the way he fell. He was wrong about all of it. He was wrong about my son, and he was wrong about me. And most of all, he was wrong about what people are willing to do for each other when the stakes are real. Daniel calls me every day. Not for any particular reason. Sometimes it's just, "Dad, do you need anything from the store?" Sometimes it's longer. We talk about his work, about the school where I volunteer, about the news, about baseball, about nothing at all. Each time my phone shows his name, I have a moment that I don't think will ever fully go away, a half second of something that is the memory of when those calls weren't possible, and then it passes and I answer. "Hey," I say. "Hey, Dad," he says. And it is the most ordinary sentence in the world, and I am grateful for every syllable of it. I was a high school principal. I shaped young lives. I kept kids on the right path. That is what people said, and I suppose it was true. But it is not what I would say now if someone asked me what I am. What I am is a father. What I did was refuse to accept the story someone else tried to write about my son. What I am is still here, still standing, still holding the line, and my son is standing next to me. If there is anything I want you to take from this, it is not the fraud case or the timestamps or the federal courtroom. It is the simpler thing underneath all of that. My son spent 3 years in prison rather than let a powerful man destroy his father's life. He thought protecting me meant keeping quiet. He didn't know that the thing I needed most was not protection. It was him. Tell the people you're protecting. They can handle it. And if they can't handle it, they deserve the chance to try. That is what I know now. At 63, with a bad hip and a crooked fence finally set straight, and a son who calls me every single day. It is enough. It is more than enough.